think that's always problematic. We don't have everybody's input. And as Richard aptly pointed out, a lot of us did not choose to make comment on some of these things rather than just taking a vote. So hopefully we, in the future, think about that a little more deeply and actually put in our comments that we think, because I think you get a lot more from the comments than you do just looking at a number on a sheet, on a spreadsheet. So, anybody? Bill?
Yeah, I have some more comments, and I wrote them out and thought about this a lot, because after I read these comments, I thought about them, and I share some of the concern. And as I look at these and think back over the last 18 months, and Mr. Jelensik, I'm going to address you in this, that as I've observed, you've taken unilateral actions that to me are clear violations of fiduciary duty, and by implication placed our fiduciary duty as a board at risk. And the common theme is the disrespect for the governing rules of the organization. To be more specific, I'm talking about the disregard for confidentiality of materials or decisions reviewed or made by this board. But I want to be very clear about this. The comments I'm making today have nothing to do with Mr. Jelensik's views regarding the issues this board faces, nor is it about his fair challenges to staff and other expert opinions presented to us. And in fact, I believe very strongly that minority views properly conveyed are vitally important to fostering honest and robust decision-making and board oversight of this organization. So, given that there have been multiple times this has happened over the last 18 months, and I say this all very reluctantly, there are only, in my view, only two possible solutions to protect the fund from the risk of continued fiduciary violations. The first would be for Mr. Jelensik to voluntarily resign his board position, although it's clear that he possesses extensive knowledge in the investment arena as well as valuable historical perspective on all matters pertaining to CalPERS. This behavior, again, in my opinion, negates the advantages he brings to the board and the constituents he represents. If he chooses to remain on the board, I ask the board president to place on the board agenda as soon as possible an action item regarding sanction or sanctions to be imposed by this board. And one sanction I ask to be considered would prohibit Mr. Jelensik from attending any closed sessions conducted by any committee or the full board while he remains a member of this board due to his repeated unauthorized disclosure of confidential material.
Others' comments? JJ?
You can think about it, Bill. You've had the questions for a while, the responses for a while. I'm going to ask you to be specific about it. But let me point out, I have been the source of every single confidentiality breach since I've been on the board. And in one case, several of the board members actually beat up on me. And Rob came to my defense and pointed out that, well, JJ could not have leaked that particular piece of information because it has not been given to any board member. So I am not the source of all leaks. Let me give you a very specific, recent example. There was a backroom deal meeting, which I think was mischaracterized, but that's how it got labeled, that involved the Department of Finance, our staff, and some of the unions. Now, I don't know who was at that meeting, but I do know that Dave Lowe was one of the people at the meeting. And in Dave's description of the meeting, he complained that he was told the expected return on the portfolio was 5.8%. That number has not been used in open session anywhere. He also complained that he was really disappointed that no board member had told him about that number. So, given who the players were, that leak either came from the Department of Finance, which I don't know how they would have it, or it came from our staff. That's a very specific example. Clearly, I was not identified as the leak. So that, you know, but give me the specific examples you're talking about, Bill. We can talk about it.
Well, what I'm making is a recommendation that this be taken up by the full board, and that would be give plenty of time for everyone to have a chance to weigh in without having to do it on the fly. So that's what I'm suggesting. That would give you both time and other members of this board time to consider this issue and to prepare a defense and et cetera.
Okay, then I will say that I cannot refute a unspecific allegation. But I also know that there are people on this board who have been taking shots at me for years and years. And so I am real careful not to disclose things that happen in closed session.
All right, Ron?
You know, I was mentioning to Bill at the break that, you know, I keep talking about this previous board that I was on. It's fairly contentious. But we had these board self-evaluation meetings, which typically were like a 4-hour deal, right? And we needed it, and rightly so. What we did was we sort of identified issues and then focused on the ones where we had concerns. And this, you know, the stuff we're talking about now would clearly be one of those concerns. And talk about, you know, best practices and what can we do differently and how best to do this and that and all of that. And you know, maybe there's a way to do that. I'm just concerned that, Bill, what you're suggesting moves it from focused discussion and hopefully improvement to like a trial, which sort of gives me the creeps a little bit. I'm not sure we need to get to that point in order to sort of work through this.
Dana?
Well, in looking at our evaluations, clearly this is an issue that I think maybe it's an undercurrent, but maybe it's time it rises to the surface. I'm not sure the exact methodology, but I think for us to strengthen ourselves as a board, it's important that we deal with it. I'm thinking similar to Ron. I'm not sure, Ron, I'm not, or Bill, I'm not sure exactly level of a trial, but I think it's important that maybe we get some consensus on, to JJ's point too, on exactly what these issues are, and do discuss them, because I think it's reached that point, and I think we would be better served as a board. I take input for methodology, but to go through some type of process.
Richard?
So just a few minutes. So first, I want to back up. I think this report and the information that's come out is very important. And first, I want to appreciate everybody on this board. I mean,
Right.
before we get into this, the second is,
Right.
I've worked with a lot of boards. I've worked in very stressful situations. I know I can be a complete pain in the rear. I know I can be short and all that. And I appreciate both the forgiveness I get from members of this board and the understanding. And I want to say, Rob, while there are issues, I mean, politics and policy, I don't feel that I don't get the opportunity to voice my opinion. I mean, I know we had our little soliloquy yesterday, Mr. Slate, about did my questions go far, but it got handled well. I mean, which is exactly the way it should be done. And so I don't want us, first of all, to lose sight of where we've come significantly far. I mean, as Eric said, this is a snapshot in time. And again, I think that the good things is, it is the congeniality. I was talking, I think it was with Dana the other day, I think sometimes we have become too congenial. I mean, in that, and I think it's actually reflected in some of the comments is, if we don't think that the committee structure is correct or that the agenda is proper, we should raise those issues, and no one should feel threatened. I mean, when you look at some of the comments, some of this is communication, and some of this is just process. It's not, and at times, I don't think we want to offend each other. So and that's why I always try, I think at last month's meeting, I know I got short, it was contentious, a lot was going on around me, but you come back because it's never meant to be personal. I mean, and I think that's the goal. I think where we are right now, with Mr. Jelinczyk and others, and I'm not going to drag Mr. Jacobs into this, but part of the struggle sometimes is, what are the rules? I struggle with, I think Mr. Jelinczyk is right. We talk about a lot of innuendos, and we may not be happy with something, and I'm not happy with what the press says, on some of the articles that are out there right now, and some of the actions we've been taking, and what do we say, not say? And part of it is tone, and I recognize I have significant tone issues. I mean, I try to, I think it was Karen was still here, she goes, you got to take your lawyer hat off sometimes, your questions, which is exactly what my wife says to me when I'm talking to the kids, is lose the tone. But that's who we are. I mean, that's part of it. And I think, Mr. Slayton, as you raise these issues, and I've spent a lot of time talking with Mr. Jelinczyk, I mean, I always say, is it true, is it not true? If it's, what's the problem? If you've got an issue, raise it. I think a lot of it does come to guidance as to, I struggle as to what can we talk about, not talk about. Where is confidential, not confidential? If I don't agree with a policy decision, do I lose my right to express that? And say, because we're 13 independent people, some are elected by constituency, some are by appointed. We have a process question here, and I think part of it we need, I would just suggest a little bit along the line of Ron, we've jumped fairly quickly. I'd like to pull it back. The outcome may still be the same, but what's the process? If in fact Mr. Jelinczyk has disclosed something, what was it? And in fact, absent the two things that you suggested, based upon what Ms. Dunning told us, there is an outcome or a penalty or something. I'm at a loss for words right now, but the action has a repercussion. So if there's in fact a repercussion, before we get to yours, is what was the action, what was the violation, and there's the repercussion. So I hate the word trial as well, but all of us are guilty of it. I mean, it is very difficult sometimes to wonder, because there's so much information, what was in closed session, what wasn't in closed session, what did I slip on, not slip on. And that's why I like the narrowness of continuing what's in closed session, because it helps. But I think a healthy and vigorous debate and pointing and challenging people is good. But I also don't want us to lose sight that overall it looks like the health of the organization is good and in a good place, and we have stuff to tinker with. But I do think, JJ, and you and I have talked about this, a lot of it is in delivery. It's in tone. It's pointing out. I think, and you and I have spoken, I've encouraged you, talk to Rob. If there's an issue, I mean, you rightfully brought to our attention a couple weeks ago the calendar. You called me, I said, put it in writing to the chair of the governance committee and the vice. Is that a policy issue as it relates to the calendar? Or, and then we got it worked out, found out exactly what the problem was. Very simple, very matter of fact. So a lot of it is just process. So, Bill, I get exactly where you're going.
My concern is the part that I'm talking about is not about tone. This is about very specific potential violation where confidential information has been released without the authority of this board. And so that's what I'm trying to get to. And I didn't have a vehicle for doing that besides raising this issue and then giving us time to schedule it and talk about it.
And that's a great point, because then that goes right back to the process is, if there's a violation, is it something that's brought to the president's attention with the general counsel opining on it, or is it exactly as you're suggesting? I mean, what's the remedy to get there? If something's happened between this board meeting and our next one and something pops up, do we wait, calendar it, bring it up, or what's the process? It's a great governance issue.
Priya?
So I don't think it's appropriate to characterize this as a trial. First of all, it was just a recommendation. Second of all, this is not really about punishment. It's really about a significant risk that faces this organization around a breach of confidentiality. And I did not hear Bill suggest that every breach of confidentiality has had a single source, but I do think and I think we've all been in the room when there have been clear breaches by Mr. Jelinczyk. And I do think we should share what those incidents were. Obviously, that needs to be transparent and give an opportunity to respond. And I think that is appropriately agendized at a future meeting. And so I think that is appropriate. That is our job, is to protect this organization and to protect our members by protecting this organization. So those are my comments.
Thank you. Anybody else? Any comments?
Let me
JJ?
just pipe up, if I might, to talk about what the governance policy says with respect to this issue, and I'll just read it to you. It's in section B on page 7, and it says that the board reserves the following powers for itself. All remaining powers are delegated to committee of the board, and then the second thing it identifies is to conduct discipline if a member fails to meet board standards of conduct. And it then goes on to say, the board will be responsible for implementing public disciplinary action against a board member whose conduct fails to meet the standards outlined in or violate this governance policy, or whose conduct is otherwise inconsistent with board policies. Discipline will be at the discretion of the board after considering the nature and number of violations, and may include, but need not be limited to, admonishment, censure, temporary termination of a board member's travel privileges, or the requirement of additional training. Any public discipline will be imposed in open session at a duly noticed meeting of the board, and only upon adoption of a motion by the board. So that's what it says. There is a parallel provision that talks about the discipline that the president can impose privately, but that's not what is on the table for Mr. Slayton's request.
Thank you, and I will say, I have to be completely honest, that I was against doing this in open session. And Matt and I had many conversations about it. I thought that the initial discussion should be done in closed till we knew where we were gonna go. But then on second thought, if we conduct the business of our country on Twitter, I guess we can have this meeting here. So, the requests have been made to agendize it. I think Mr. Jelensik is correct. He needs to be able to hear all the information factually, to be able to react to it and respond to it. So I will work with Marcy, and we will put it on a agenda in the near future to have this discussion, and then the board can take any action that if it so chooses to do. This is a tough topic and a tough discussion, but hope we can continue to handle it collegially and as professionals. So, JJ?
Yeah, and I think I should acknowledge that I was the one who actually asked to do it in open session, because I think our members and the board need to actually have the conversation. I also believed that it would be less hostile if people were held accountable for what they were saying. So it's an open session because I asked it.
It is, and to be honest, I did call JJ and give him a heads up that this was going to be a little problematic, and ask him his position one way or the other. Originally, he thought closed was a good idea. Upon further thought, he thought open was a better place. So that's where we ended up.
But I'll point out that Bill has some very specific violations in mind that at this point he has chosen not to disclose. But there have been a few times that I've been called in to talk about violations. And two of them that I remember was, we were investigated by the SEC. That's public record. You can see that on the SEC website. It was Matt, not me, that disclosed it was for insider trading. I also got chewed out for raising the issue. We had a vote in closed session. I raised the issue, should we report it out? We were told we didn't have to. But it was Henry, not I, that disclosed that it was about releasing a report to the board. So if those were violations, I don't think I was the violator. And other than that, I don't know what specific ones he has in mind, so I can't respond to this specific.
That's why we'll agendize, we put everything on the table and everybody can have their say. Anybody else?
Can I
Priya?
just ask a question? If these, if we're talking about if some of the evidence is confidential information, what does that mean for whether this discussion ought to happen in closed session or an open session, or both perhaps, such that we don't inadvertently disclose additional confidential closed session material?
It's part of what we have to weigh it, but if it's confidential information, it's already been leaked, and that's what we're discussing, it's already there. So we just need not go into any further confidential information. But if what Bill's talking about is things that have already been leaked that were confidential, it's out there anyway.
Is that our general counsel's opinion? I guess I would just ask.
Well, I think it's a
that we
good
review
question.
that.
I think that there's a manner of handling it in open session without getting into additional confidential information. And I think that board members and others would need to be sensitive to that issue, but I think it could be handled.
Very cautiously. Anybody else have questions, comments? All right, well, thank you, and this is not an easy topic to deal with, but one that's been in the background for a while, and something that board members felt that we needed to bring forward. So glad we did, kept it fairly level, so let's continue to do so and work through this. So this concludes